Now, what I want to begin tonight to do is to show you just how full the Bible is about migration in all kinds of ways. And tonight we're just going to look at a slice of it. And that's why I'm saying in the subtitle here, let the Bible orient us on this. Now, this is going to be the supreme challenge today, but the challenge is to think very explicitly as Christians and profoundly with our Bible. And one of the things that many people don't realize is that this whole issue of migration actually is central to the Christian faith. If you were to turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, it tells us that all Christians are sojourners, that all Christians are strangers in this place. What you begin to see is that migration is a central metaphor for what it means to be a Christian. Now, that's kind of an interesting idea, because it might be telling us that if we want to learn more about what it means to be a Christian, maybe we need to know a little bit more about migration. If we want to know more about what it means to be a Christian, maybe we need to get to know some immigrants. Interesting take on it, isn't it? Because this is supposed to be a strange place to us. We have a different king. We have a different set of values. We're part of a different community, which we call the church. We are strangers in a strange land, the Bible tells us. The problem is for many that this is no longer a strange place. We rather like it. And what we want to do is keep the strangers out. You see, how might this kind of orientation begin to even change how we think about our lives in general? Where we begin to appreciate that immigrants are vulnerable people and often excluded and marginalized, which is part of what it means to be a Christian in the modern world. Maybe the whole thing will begin to change. And maybe what we need to do is go to chapter 1, page 1 of our Bibles, Genesis chapter 1, and to begin the conversation literally at the beginning. And what we begin to see if we begin in Genesis 1 is that we're talking about the image of God. That people, all people, no matter where they come from, no matter what race they are, no matter what ethnic background, anything about them, it doesn't matter. Everyone is made in the image of God, and everyone has value. Infinite value. So much value that Jesus will die for each one of us. But there's something else about Genesis 1 that's interesting too, that most people miss. And it's this. In Genesis 1, the image of God is linked to the idea of ruling the earth and of subduing it. Now you're not only talking about the value of every person, you're talking about the infinite potential of every person. Every human being has the capacity and the privilege of ruling the earth. Now, if we begin with the idea that immigrants are valuable in the sight of God and they are productive and have potential, it changes the conversation, doesn't it? See, where do we begin the conversation? Well, we begin in the Bible. And here I have this idea of two different ways of reading the Bible. If you're a confessing Christian and I were to ask you this evening, how did you come to faith? You would tell me a story. You would tell me a story of one time in your life when things were really bad. Maybe it was as a child and somebody got sick, or maybe you did, or maybe it was your marriage or your parents, or something happened that drove you to your knees. So you were vulnerable and God reached out. What can the Bible teach us? What can the Bible show us? Well, it's full of stories. Great stories. Abram. But Abram, right, is in Ur, the area of ancient Babylon, by the Euphrates in what is now modern Iraq. He begins to move at the end of chapter 11 of Genesis. And he goes up to Haran with his family and is there for a while. It's kind of on the border of Syria and Turkey. And then he comes down into what we now call the area of Israel and Palestine. And his life is a life of a Bedouin. He doesn't own any property ever, except for toward the end he buys a plot of ground to bury Sarah. So he's always on the move, living in tents with flocks. He's kind of a perpetual migrant. But when he comes into the land in Genesis 12, if you remember, he gets the promises at the beginning of Genesis 12, and that's all very good. And he begins to keep moving to the south, and the first thing he does is build an altar and begins to call out the name of God. And all this is very good, you see, and you keep reading, and he does it again, and this is just amazing. This is the man of faith, you see, that we're called to imitate. We just go a few more verses in Genesis chapter 12, and it tells us there's a famine in the land. A lot of those in that part of the world. And so they move the tents and pick them up, and they go to Egypt, looking for food. See, that's why people migrate. You see, they're looking to survive and to eat, to feed their families, maybe find work. Now we know from archaeology that Egypt had built a series of forts along its eastern frontier. So Egypt had the Nile, and there was water. And so there would be crops and harvests. And so they had to monitor the people coming in and out, because people were always coming in looking for food. And it helps explain why, if you read the story, as they're moving, you see, Abram will tell his wife, Sarai, look, when they ask you, tell them that you're my sister and not my wife. And she goes along with it. You see, you get to the border, and you're hungry. And he's not just the head of an immediate, nuclear family. I mean, he's the head of a clan. I mean, he's responsible for a number of people and animals, and he has to feed all of them. He's the one who's responsible. He gets to the border, and he lies to get across. You see, when you're desperate, you do desperate things. Even if it means lying to feed your family. And what was the option? To turn around and go back into the desert and die? Have you ever thought of Abram as an immigrant story? The great father of the faith is an immigrant desperately wanting to feed his family. Joseph, that's an interesting one. Honest man, hardworking, becomes the steward of the home, taking care of everything. And Potiphar is happy to leave him in charge, even if he travels, and he does. And then, as you might remember the story, his wife tries to seduce Joseph. Of course, he will have none of that. And she reports all of this in her twisted way to the authorities, and who are they going to believe? The immigrant from Israelite territory, or the Egyptian? Well, they believe her. And he goes to jail, and there he interprets dreams, and he comes out, and again, very well, because of his honesty and because of his insights, he ends up being second over all of Egypt. And he becomes very assimilated. If you read the story, he takes Egyptian name. He marries an Egyptian woman. He has children by her. But interestingly, even though he has taken an Egyptian name, even though he is assimilating and taken an Egyptian wife, and he must speak Egyptian, he gives his two sons Israelite names. So he hasn't forgotten who he is. He hasn't forgotten his roots. And then when his brothers come, because they're hungry, looking for food, they come before him and they don't recognize him. Even as he's talking to them, he understands them, but he uses an interpreter. It gives him time to process. And he goes behind the curtain and cries. Remember the scene? But the point is this. He never forgot his mother tongue. See, being bilingual is a gift to the country, not something to be afraid of. And then his time comes for his death. He says, take my bones home. He never forgot his native land. Egypt's more awkward. Exodus chapter 1. What was it that scared the Egyptians? If you read the account, it tells us that the Israelites kept multiplying and multiplying and multiplying until they hit such a number that the Egyptians were afraid. Now, what was the trigger point? What was that number? We don't know. But what you have is a very common natural response to the growth of a large immigrant population. And the contradictory thing the Egyptians do, you see, even as they get more and more scared and bothered, then they make it harder for them to make the bricks. But they keep the quotas going. And you go, that makes no economic sense. Right? I mean, the bricks are for Egyptian buildings. I mean, you would think they'd want good bricks. You would think they'd want efficient brick making because these are for Egyptian buildings. But this is a contradictory response of people who are worried about an immigrant population. Oh, but the Hispanics, you see, they're everywhere. There's too many of them. Naomi and Ruth. You know that story, don't you? Naomi and her husband and sons go to Moab because there's famine and they're hungry, and they go to Moab, the other side of the Dead Sea. And it's interesting because the sons marry Moabite women. So if you're the Moabite, like Ruth, you've just married an immigrant. But then the husband of Naomi dies, and the two sons die, and now there's 3 widows. One will stay, but Naomi will go back with Ruth. And now Ruth, who had married an immigrant and is the widow of an immigrant, now she becomes the immigrant. And the rest of the book is the story of all the struggles to assimilate into Bethlehem. And it's kind of awkward. When she does that great declaration, I will go with you, and your God will be my God, and your people my people, I will be with you until I die. Naomi doesn't say a word. She doesn't say thank you and yes, we can do this together. We got to hang together on this, Yes, we can do this. Thank you so much. She says nothing. And they get to Bethlehem and they arrive, and all the women of the town come out to greet Naomi, and they hug her and they kiss her, and Naomi doesn't even mention Ruth. That must have been an awkward scene. Ruth probably standing over to the side, kind of looking different and not knowing what to do. And what do you say? Chapter 2, she begins to work in the fields. She has the right to as an immigrant woman and a widow. And when Boaz shows up at the fields, which are his, he says, well, who's that woman over there? And normally when I've heard people talking, they go, oh, she must have been a really good-looking woman, because otherwise how would Boaz have just kind of pointed her out? Well, maybe that was true. But maybe she was just dressed funny, looked different, kind of standing by herself. And when he asks the workers, well, who is that? They don't even know her name. Well, that's the Moabitess. And she's been working hard all day. She hasn't taken a break, all day. See, they don't know her name. They just know she works hard. That's what you see in the story. Fascinating story of her getting accepted bit by bit into this little town. The elders will compare her to the great women of Israel's past. Of course, Boaz will marry her, but if you read the text carefully, every time he's in public, he still calls her the Moabitess. So she can't get past the label. At the end of the story, you get the genealogy of David, and what you begin to see is that this little immigrant family is part of a bigger story that they didn't even imagine. Daniel. Last of the stories for the evening. I love to tell this story because, again, we kind of misread the story. We don't see it as a story of someone far from home. And when they take them away, just like the Babylonians would do, they would take the best and the brightest and mold them into, people to work for the empire. And they change their names. They educate them. And in fact, they come out better than anybody else. I mean, these are bright, young foreigners. And then they want to change their diet, and that's where Daniel says, we're going to stay with our diet. And we kind of read through that, don't even stop and just see what's happening. Because food is a cultural marker. If I want to, know if I'm in an Hispanic part of Denver, how do I know that? Well, there's a pupuseria, there's taquerias, and there's panaderias. You know by the restaurants where you are. And this is always very interesting when I was, newly married because, I'd grown up kind of this kind of half-breed and mixed kind of thing, and my wife was, what was he say in Spanish, pura gringa, total American from the suburbs, and, I have certain ideas of what you eat for Christmas, right? And in Guatemala, Christmas Eve, Nochebuena, you have like black beans, tamales, Guatemalan tamales, and taquitos. And so, we're getting ready for Christmas, and what shall we eat? Well, Christmas Eve, you need to do the black beans and the tamales. And she goes, no. It's Christmas Day, and we're going to have turkey, and we're going to have ham, we're going to have pies, and mashed potatoes. And I said, no. You don't understand. It's actually Christmas Eve, and we do the black beans. So now we've negotiated this. So now we do both. So Christmas is a happy time in our family. But the food. That's why if you ever travel, one of the things you yearn for is what? Your food. You ever thought of Daniel's An Immigrant Story? This is a cartoon from the 1890s. And it says, United States of America, admittance free, walk in and welcome. And then here's the immigrant, right? Looking at this caricature, I think there's probably an Eastern European Jew of the time. And you can see what the immigrant brings. And now just listen to the national conversation that we have today. You see, what do immigrants bring? They bring poverty, and they bring disease, and they bring anarchy. If this is the tension that the country's been living in for 250 years since the founding of the Republic, how do we respond as Christians, you see? If this is the national reality, how do we do this? And I'll wrap up. We need to form an explicitly Christian perspective, and I've just given you a little bit. There's so much more. We've talked about how central this whole migration piece is to the Bible, and like I said, there's much, much more. So now what? Well, let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts. Let's begin to read the Bible. Let's just begin there. And what I would say, it's okay to not like this. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to wonder. It's okay to grapple with this. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do as Christians, right? The other part of it, I would say, is don't simplify too much the discussion. And I hear simplifications on both sides. On the advocacy side, it's, immigrants are great people. Well, they are, but, if you're a Christian, they're also sinners. And they're just like you and me. I go to a Hispanic church. I can tell you stories. Well, what else would you expect? Because they're actually people, and that's what people do. So we don't need to idealize the immigrant, even as we begin to formulate a biblical view on immigration. And we don't need to go the other way with all the anger and exclusion and punishment kind of idea. Because even the tone of that isn't very constructive. And lastly, I would say, let's just pray. So pray that God will use the church to be a voice for compassion and truth, and for order properly conceived, not only for the good of the immigrant, but also for the good of the country. Let the Bible orient us and feed our souls so that we can capture the heart of the metaphor of being a migrant. And as we do that, we'll actually learn what it means to be a Christian. Thank you.